The neon sign of Sullivan's Diner flickered, casting a sickly, bruised glow over the cracked linoleum floor. Nora knelt there, her waitress apron stained with spilled coffee and trembling hands pressing against her chest. Towering above her was Silas Russo, the ruthless head of the Russo Syndicate, a man whose very name was a death sentence in this city. She didn't beg for her life or make empty promises. Instead, with a voice trembling like a fraying wire, she whispered the words that would ignite an underworld war. "It wasn't a rival family," she gasped, tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks. "My father and my brother did it." What the devil of the city did next defied every brutal rule he had ever lived by. The air inside Sullivan's Diner smelled of burnt grease, cheap vanilla sanitizer, and the desperation of 3 a.m. Nora stood behind the Formica counter, a damp rag in her hand, wiping away a coffee ring that had been there since midnight. She was 23, but the heavy bags under her eyes and the bruised, purplish hue of her knuckles made her look a decade older. Working the graveyard shift in the forgotten edge of the city was a necessity, not a choice. It was the only way to keep the electricity on in the dilapidated apartment she shared with the ghosts of her mistakes, and the very real, very dangerous debts of her family. The bell above the glass door chimed, slicing through the hum of the broken refrigerator. Nora didn't look up immediately. "Take a seat anywhere," she muttered, tossing the rag into the sink. "Coffee's fresh, but the grill is off." "I am not here for the food." The voice was low, laced with a quiet authority that instantly turned the air in the room to ice. Nora froze. She slowly lifted her gaze, her breath catching in her throat. The man standing just inside the doorway looked like a shadow that had decided to wear a bespoke suit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp patrician features and eyes the color of a stormy sea. Silas Russo. Even a waitress in a run-down diner knew the face of the man who controlled the city's docks, politicians, and shadows. Behind him stood 2 massive men in dark overcoats, their postures rigid, their eyes scanning the empty diner like wolves cornering a wounded deer. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "We're closed," she managed to say, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Silas didn't blink. He walked towards the counter with a predatory grace, the expensive leather of his shoes making no sound against the cheap tiles. He slid onto the stool directly across from her. Up close, the aura of danger radiating from him was suffocating. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and a faint, metallic trace of gunpowder. "Nora Hayes," Silas said. It wasn't a question. He let her name roll off his tongue as if he were tasting it, testing it for poison. "Daughter of Richard Hayes, sister to Tommy." Nora's grip on the edge of the counter tightened until her knuckles turned white. "I don't know where they are," she lied, though the tremor in her voice was a dead giveaway. "I haven't seen them in weeks. If they owe you money, I don't have it." Silas tilted his head slightly, a dark curl falling over his forehead. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Nora flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, he withdrew a glossy photograph and placed it face down on the counter. He slid it toward her with a single, gloved finger. "3 nights ago, a warehouse on 8th Avenue was burned to the ground," Silas began, his tone terrifyingly conversational. "Inside that warehouse was a shipment of pharmaceuticals meant for my clinics. More importantly, inside that warehouse was my uncle Vincent." Silas paused, his jaw tightening just a fraction. He did not make it out. Nora stared at the back of the photograph, her stomach churning. She knew what was coming next. The whispers in the neighborhood had been frantic for days. The Russo family had been hit, and the streets were bleeding as Silas hunted down the culprits. "The police think it was an electrical fire," Silas continued, leaning in closer. "My men know it was arson, and the security cameras from a pawn shop across the street caught a rusted blue Chevrolet fleeing the scene 2 minutes before the explosion. A Chevrolet registered to a Tommy Hayes." "No, Nora whispered, the blood draining from her face. "No, Tommy is stupid. He's an addict. But he couldn't. Turn the photo over, Nora," Silas commanded softly. With trembling fingers, Nora reached out and flipped the picture. It wasn't a picture of the fire. It was a still frame from a grainy security camera. It showed her brother, Tommy, laughing behind the wheel of his car. Beside him in the passenger seat was her father, Richard, holding a metallic briefcase that bore the Russo family crest. The diner spun. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ragged sound of Nora's own breathing. She was a dead woman standing. The Mafia did not believe in coincidences, and they certainly did not believe in sparing the bloodline of those who crossed them. "I will ask you once, and your answer will determine whether you walk out of this diner alive," Silas said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Who hired them?" Nora looked into the eyes of the devil. She saw no mercy there, only a cold, calculated void waiting to consume her. She thought about lying. She thought about screaming for help. But who would come? The cops were likely on his payroll, and her family, the men who had doomed her, were long gone. A sudden, bitter laugh escaped her lips, sounding foreign and broken in the quiet diner. Silas's eyes narrowed at the sound. "Who hired them?" Nora repeated, her voice cracking. The fear suddenly gave way to a lifetime of repressed rage and agonizing exhaustion. "You think some rival boss hired two low-life junkies to take down the mighty Russo syndicate? Careful," one of the guards behind Silas growled, taking a step forward. Silas raised a hand, silencing his man without looking away from Nora. "Explain." Tears finally breached the dams of her eyelashes, spilling down her pale cheeks. "There is no rival family. There is no grand conspiracy, Mr. Russo. They did it for the cash in that briefcase. My father and my brother did it. All on their own. And do you want to know the best part? Do you want to know the real tragedy of your uncle's death?" Nora leaned across the counter, the smell of fear rolling off her. Yet her gaze was fiercely locked with Silas's. "They didn't even know it was your warehouse. My father owed 60 grand to the Boyle brothers for a gambling debt. The Boyles told them if they didn't pay by Friday, they were dead." So Richard and Tommy got high, drove around the industrial district, and picked the least guarded building they could find to rob. They hit the guards, grabbed whatever looked valuable, and threw a Molotov cocktail on the way out to cover their tracks. Silas remained motionless. Not a single muscle in his face twitched, but the air around him seemed to crackle with dangerous electricity. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that the architect of my uncle's murder was not a cartel boss, but a degenerate gambler and a junkie." "Yes," Nora sobbed, the fight leaving her body all at once. She slumped against the counter. "They came to my apartment afterward. They were terrified when they realized what the briefcase was. They packed their bags. They took every cent of my savings, money I had been hiding for 3 years to escape them, and then—" She choked on a sob, her hands covering her face. "And then what, Nora?" Silas urged, his voice strangely devoid of its earlier venom. "Then my father told me to stay here," she whispered through her fingers. "He told me that when the Russos came looking, I needed to play dumb. He left me here as bait. He knew you would find the car's registration. He knew you would come for me. He left me to die so they could buy enough time to cross the border." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the diner. The two guards shifted uncomfortably, exchanging bewildered glances. The narrative of the underworld was built on respect, retaliation, and calculated warfare. The idea that two pathetic addicts had accidentally murdered a Mafia patriarch and then sacrificed their own daughter to cover their escape was pathetic. It was grotesque. Nora closed her eyes, waiting for the bullet. She knew how this worked. Blood demanded blood. She was a haze, and she would pay the price for the sins of her father. "Just do it," she whispered, keeping her eyes shut. "Please, just make it quick. I'm so tired." She heard the slide of a bar stool. She heard the soft thud of footsteps approaching. She braced herself, her body tensing for the pain. Instead, she felt the rough, warm leather of a glove gently brush a stray tear from her cheek. Nora's eyes flew open. Silas Russo was standing directly in front of her, separated only by the narrow diner counter. The cold void in his eyes had shifted, replaced by something dark, intense, and unfathomable. "My men will burn this diner to the ground," Silas said quietly, his gaze locked onto hers. Nora swallowed hard. "Okay. And when the police find the ashes, they will find the remains of a waitress who tragically died in the fire." Nora's breath hitched. She didn't understand. Why? Silas reached out, his gloved hand closing around her wrist. His grip was firm, yet surprisingly gentle. He pulled her slightly forward, forcing her to look directly into his storm-grey eyes. For the first time, she noticed a faint scar running along his jawline, a testament to his own violent past. "Because the men who killed my uncle are dead men walking," Silas declared, his voice a low, vibrating hum that sent shivers down her spine. "But the woman they abandoned, she is coming with me." "What?" Nora gasped, trying to pull her hand back, but his grip was like iron. "No, you don't understand. I'm a Hayes. You're supposed to kill me." "I am the boss of the Russo family," Silas murmured, his face inches from hers. "I dictate who lives and who dies. Your father and brother threw you to the wolves, Nora, but they forgot one crucial detail." "What?" she breathed, mesmerized and terrified by the raw power radiating from him. A slow, dark smile curved Silas's lips, a smile that promised both salvation and absolute ruin. "I am the wolf, and I protect what is mine. Get your coat. We have a hunt to plan." The drive to Long Island's North Shore was a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and the suffocating scent of expensive leather. Nora sat frozen in the back of the armored Mercedes-Maybach S680, her cheap diner uniform a stark, humiliating contrast to the immaculate midnight blue interior. Beside her, Silas Russo was a statue carved from obsidian. He hadn't spoken a word since he gave the order to ignite Sullivan's diner. When Nora had looked back through the tinted window, the flames were already licking the sky, consuming the only anchor she had left in the world. Officially, Nora Hayes was dead, her life, reduced to ash and an open case file in an overworked precinct. "You are shaking," Silas observed. His voice broke the heavy silence, lacking the venom it had carried in the diner, yet still commanding enough to make her flinch. "I don't exist anymore," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She stared at her bruised hands, resting limply in her lap. "My father left me for dead. And you actually killed me." Silas turned his head, the passing streetlights catching the sharp angles of his face and the faint, silvery scar on his jaw. "I gave you a clean slate. In my world, a ghost holds more power than a corpse. By morning, the detectives will find dental records my men planted. The Boyle brothers will believe their loose ends are tied up, and Richard and Tommy will believe their cowardly sacrifice was successful." He reached over, not to touch her, but to pour a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a heavy glass. He offered it to her. "Drink. You will need your strength." Nora took the glass. The Macallan burned down her throat, settling as a warm knot in her empty stomach. An hour later, the massive wrought-iron gates of the Russo estate parted like the jaws of a beast. The property was a fortress disguised as a palatial manor, surrounded by 10-foot stone walls and patrolled by men who moved with lethal purpose. When the car stopped beneath the grand portico, Silas's right-hand man, a terrifyingly stoic enforcer named Harrison Locke, opened the door. "Sir, the perimeter is secure. No chatter on the wire regarding the diner yet," Harrison reported, his eyes briefly flicking to Nora with a mixture of confusion and intense calculation. "See to it that the narrative sticks, Harrison," Silas ordered, stepping out into the cold night air. He extended a gloved hand to Nora. "Welcome to your purgatory, Miss Hayes." For the next 3 days, Nora lived in a state of suspended animation within a lavish guest wing that felt more like a gilded cage. The sheer scale of Silas's wealth was disorienting. She was provided with clothes that cost more than her father's gambling debts: cashmere sweaters, silk dresses, tailored trousers from boutiques on Fifth Avenue. But beneath the luxury, she was acutely aware of the guard standing outside her oak doors. On the fourth evening, the silence was shattered. Nora was sitting in the sprawling, mahogany-panelled library, staring blankly at a first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo, when the double doors swung open. Silas strode in. The bespoke armor of his suit was gone, replaced by a simple black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faint, jagged tattoos. There was a smear of dried blood on his knuckles. "Get up," he commanded. Nora stood instantly, her heart hammering. "What happened?" "We found the rusted blue Chevrolet," Silas said, walking toward a massive antique desk and pouring himself a drink. He didn't offer her one this time. It was abandoned near a scrapyard in Newark, cleaned with bleach, but my men found a burner phone wedged deep beneath the passenger seat. Tommy's, presumably. Nora's breath hitched. "Did you find them?" "No," Silas growled, slamming his glass down with enough force to make Nora jump. "But we retrieved the call logs. The last number your idiot brother dialed before the warehouse fire was not a random payout line. It was traced to a private club in Atlantic City, the Obsidian Room." Nora recognized the name. The blood drained from her face. "That's Mick Boyle's club, the Boyle brothers." Silas closed the distance between them, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. The scent of copper and violence clung to him. "You told me your father hit my warehouse blindly, that he just picked a building to pay off his debt to the Boyles." "That's what he told me," Nora cried, stepping back until her spine hit the bookshelves. "I swear it, Silas. He was terrified. He said it was random." Silas reached out, his hand slamming into the bookshelf just inches from her head, caging her in. His stormy eyes bore into hers, searching for the lie. "The Boyles are mid-level bottom feeders. They run loan sharking and illegal betting. They do not have the spine to hit the Russo family. Not unless someone bigger gave them the green light and the blueprints." Nora's mind raced. The pieces were locking together in a horrifying picture. "They didn't just extort my father," she breathed, the realization chilling her to the bone. "They pointed him like a loaded gun. Mick Boyle knew my father was desperate. He gave him the target. He used Richard and Tommy to hit your uncle so the Russo syndicate would look for two junky ghosts instead of the real architects." Silas's jaw tightened. "A disposable assassination. They set my family up to take the fall for a Mafia hit," Nora whispered, a sudden, unfamiliar fury igniting in her chest. For her entire life, she had been a victim of her father's vices. But this? Her family had been used as pawns in a war they didn't even know existed, and she had been left as collateral damage. Silas watched the shift in her eyes. He watched the terror melt into a cold, hardened rage. It was the same look he saw in his own reflection. "I want to go with you," Nora stated, her voice shockingly steady. Silas let out a harsh, dark laugh. "This is not a field trip, Nora. I am going to the Obsidian Room, and I am going to peel Mick Boyle's skin from his bones until he gives me the name of the man pulling his strings. You will stay here, where you are safe." "They knew my father," Nora countered, stepping forward, closing the small gap between them, her chin tilted up defiantly. "They know his tells, his safe houses. If Mick Boyle tries to feed you lies about where Richard and Tommy ran off to, I will know. You need me, Silas. I am the only one who knows how my father's pathetic mind works." Silas stared down at her. The air between them crackled, thick with a dangerous tension that had nothing to do with the impending violence, and everything to do with the fierce, unbroken spirit of the woman standing before him. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. The fire had burned away the frightened girl, leaving behind steel. "If you slow me down," Silas murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes, I will leave you in the trunk." "If I slow you down," Nora shot back, "you can shoot me yourself." Atlantic City at 2 a.m. was a neon-soaked wasteland of broken dreams, but the Obsidian Room was a fortress of exclusivity, hidden beneath a luxury casino off the boardwalk. It catered to politicians, cartel liaisons, and high-rolling degenerates. Nora walked through the velvet-draped entrance, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was wearing a backless emerald-green silk dress that Silas had coldly ordered his staff to provide. Her hair was swept up, exposing the graceful curve of her neck. She looked like a billionaire's plaything, a perfect piece of camouflage. Silas walked beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The touch burned through the thin silk, a constant, grounding reminder of the lethal force tethering her to this nightmare. Behind them, Harrison Locke and 3 other heavily armed men moved like ghosts through the crowded room. "Keep your eyes down. Smile if someone looks at you and do not speak unless I tell you to," Silas muttered into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. They moved past baccarat tables and private roulette wheels until they reached a heavily guarded VIP alcove in the back. 2 massive bouncers stepped forward, crossing their arms. "Private game, Mr. Russo," one of the bouncers rumbled. "Invitation only." Silas didn't break his stride. He didn't even raise his hand. Harrison stepped forward, and with a sickening crunch that was swallowed by the loud jazz music, drove the butt of a silenced pistol into the bouncer's ribs, then a sharp jab to his throat. The second man reached inside his jacket, but Silas was faster. In a blur of motion, Silas had a blade pressed flush against the man's carotid artery. "Tell Mick that Silas Russo is here to collect a debt," Silas whispered, his eyes dead. The man swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. Silas shoved him aside and kicked the double oak doors open. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive bourbon. Mick Boyle, a fleshy man with a florid face and a cheap, flashy diamond Rolex, was sitting at a poker table with 3 other men. The laughter died instantly as Silas entered the room. "Silas," Mick stammered, his ruddy face turning a pale shade of grey. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over his chair. "We didn't expect you. To what do we owe the honor?" "Clear the room," Silas commanded. The 3 other men didn't need to be told twice. They took one look at Harrison's leveled weapon and scrambled out the side door. Mick was left alone, sweating profusely under the dim chandelier. "Sit down, Mick," Silas said, pulling out a chair for Nora. He gestured for her to sit. She did, keeping her back straight, her hands trembling slightly in her lap out of sight. Silas remained standing, a predator circling a trapped pig. "I swear, Silas, whatever the tribute is this month, we have it. We had a good run on the sports books." "I am not here for money," Silas interrupted smoothly. He reached into his jacket and tossed the glossy photograph of the rusted blue Chevrolet onto the poker table. "I am here about a fire on 8th Avenue. The one that killed my Uncle Vincent." Mick looked at the photo, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "I read about that in the papers. A tragedy. But I don't know what this car has to do with me." "The car belongs to Tommy Hayes," Silas continued, his voice dropping an octave. "His father, Richard, owed you $60,000. Yet miraculously, 2 days before my uncle was incinerated, Richard's debt was marked as paid in your ledgers. How does a degenerate gambler pay off 60 grand overnight, Mick?" "He found a backer," Mick lied, his voice cracking. "I don't ask questions, Silas. I just collect." Silas sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He moved so fast, Nora barely registered it. He grabbed Mick by the back of his collar, slamming his face down onto the hard oak table with a resounding crack. Mick screamed as his nose shattered, blood spraying across the green felt. Silas pulled a hunting knife from his belt and slammed the blade through the back of Mick's right hand, pinning it to the table. Nora gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth, the bile rising in her throat. The brutality was raw and unfiltered. "Let's try this again," Silas whispered, leaning down so his lips were mere inches from Mick's ear. You gave Richard Hayes the blueprints to my warehouse. You told him there was cash inside. You set him up to pull the trigger so you could hide behind a junkie's mistake. Who paid you to do it, Mick? Who is buying a war with the Russos?" "I don't know," Mick sobbed, spitting blood. "I swear to God, I don't know. It was a blind drop. The money came in offshore accounts. They communicated through an encrypted app. They just said to find a disposable idiot to torch the building. Richard was desperate to save his daughter, so he took the job." Nora froze. The words echoed in her mind. Desperate to save his daughter. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Silas shot her a warning look, but Nora ignored him. She walked around the table, staring down at the bleeding, pathetic man. "What did you say?" Nora demanded, her voice shaking with a dangerous edge. Mick looked up at her, his eyes wide with pain and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" "I am Nora Hayes," she said, stepping into the light. Mick's remaining color drained away. "You're dead. The diner burned down. The cops found—" "Answer her," Silas ordered, twisting the knife just a fraction of an inch. Mick shrieked. "The 60 grand!" Mick cried out, sobbing openly now. Richard didn't owe it from gambling. He borrowed it 3 years ago to pay off a dirty cop who was threatening to frame you, Nora. He borrowed the money to keep you out of prison for a hit-and-run you didn't even know you were implicated in. The interest piled up. We told him if he didn't pay, we'd take you and sell you to the syndicates in Macau. The room spun. The floor beneath Nora's feet seemed to give way. The narrative of her entire life, the hatred for her father, the resentment, the belief that she had been abandoned as bait, shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her father hadn't abandoned her to die. He had burned down a Mafia warehouse, angered the most dangerous man in the city, and fled, all to clear a debt that was keeping her alive. He had left her behind because he thought the debt was settled, thinking she was finally safe from the boils. He never realized he had just traded her from one monster to an even worse one. "He did it for me," Nora whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her makeup. "He didn't run away from me. He ran to draw the heat." Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. For a man who had built an empire on blood and betrayal, the concept of a father sacrificing himself entirely for his child was a foreign, jarring concept. The void in his chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt in a decade. "The encrypted app," Silas demanded, turning his cold fury back to Mick. "Who was the contact?" "They used a handle," Mick gasped, his eyes rolling back slightly from the pain. "They called themselves the Architect." But Richard knew something. After the fire, when he realized who the building belonged to, he panicked. He told me he was going to leverage the real culprit. He said he found a piece of evidence in the warehouse before it burned. "Where did Richard go?" Silas asked, his voice deadly calm. "Montreal," Mick spat out, blood bubbling on his lips. "He has an old smuggler contact there. Jean-Luc, that's all I know, I swear." Silas stared at Mick for a long moment. Then, with a fluid, merciless motion, he yanked the knife free. Mick collapsed onto the floor, clutching his mangled hand. "If I see you in my city again, Mick, I will not stop at your hand," Silas promised. He turned to Nora. She was pale, shaking violently, staring at the pool of blood on the poker table. Silas reached out, his bloody, ungloved hand wrapping gently around her bare arm. "We are going to Montreal," Silas said quietly, leading her out of the blood-soaked room. As they walked back and through the blinding neon lights of the casino, Nora realized the terrifying truth. The man holding her arm was a monster. He was a killer. But as they stepped into the cold Atlantic City night, she realized something else. He was the only monster who could help her save her family. The flight to Quebec aboard Silas's private Gulfstream G650 was a study in suffocating silence. The Atlantic City adrenaline had burned out of Nora's veins, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep ache. She sat wrapped in a heavy cashmere blanket on a plush cream leather seat, staring out the window at the black expanse of the night sky. Across the cabin, Silas was reviewing tactical maps on an encrypted tablet, his jaw set in a rigid line. He had traded his blood-stained suit for a dark charcoal turtleneck and a tailored wool overcoat, looking less like a street enforcer and more like the billionaire CEO of a lethal enterprise. "You should sleep," Silas said, not looking up from his screen. "We land in 40 minutes. Montreal in December is unforgiving, and the people we are looking for are worse." "I can't sleep," Nora replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Mick Boyle's hand pinned to that table. And then I think about my father." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "For 3 years I looked at him with nothing but disgust. I thought he was just a weak man drowning his life in cheap whiskey and poker games. I didn't know he was drowning for me." Silas finally set the tablet down. He unbuckled his seatbelt and moved to the seat directly across from her. The physical proximity of him was overwhelming. A gravitational pull of danger and raw, unfiltered masculinity. "In my world," Silas began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "loyalty is usually purchased with blood or money. Unconditional sacrifice is a liability. Your father made a foolish, desperate play, but it was a play made out of love. That is rare, Nora. Do not let the guilt of misunderstanding him consume you. Channel it." Nora met his stormy, grey eyes. "Channel it into what?" "Survival," Silas answered simply. "Because whoever the architect is, they know your father took something from that warehouse, and they will scorch the earth to get it back. Jean-Luc is a ghost, but ghosts leave footprints in the snow." They touched down at Montreal Pierre Elliott Trudeau International Airport under the cover of a blinding snowstorm. Harrison Locke had a reinforced black Cadillac Escalade waiting on the tarmac. Within minutes, they were navigating the icy, treacherous streets toward the industrial edge of the port of Montreal. Jean-Luc's front was a dilapidated import-export warehouse near the edge of the St. Lawrence River. The wind howled off the freezing water, biting through Nora's thick Canada Goose parka the moment she stepped out of the vehicle. Silas immediately stepped in front of her, using his broad shoulders to block the brunt of the icy gale, his hand resting securely on the small of her back. It was a possessive, protective gesture that made Nora's heart skip a beat, despite the freezing temperature. "Stay close," Silas murmured, drawing a sleek, matte black Sig Sauer P226 from his shoulder holster. Harrison and 2 other enforcers moved to flank them, their boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. The massive corrugated metal door of the warehouse was rolled down, but a smaller side entrance stood slightly ajar. The padlock had been sheared off with bolt cutters. Silas's eyes darkened. "We are late." He kicked the door open, leading the way into the cavernous, dimly lit space. The smell of raw fish, diesel fuel, and something metallic. Blood hit Nora's nostrils. Shipping crates were stacked high, creating a labyrinth of shadows. "Spread out! Suppressors on!" Silas ordered his men. He pulled Nora behind a stack of wooden pallets, keeping his body positioned between her and the open room. A muffled groan echoed from the far corner of the warehouse. Silas moved with lethal silence, pulling Nora along with him. In a cleared-out space near a rusted forklift, they found Jean-Luc. The French-Canadian smuggler was tied to a steel chair, his face a swollen, bloody pulp. 2 men in tactical black gear were standing over him, one holding a pair of heavy pliers, the other pointing an assault rifle at Jean-Luc's head. They weren't Boyle's street thugs. These men were professionals. Cleaners. "Where did Richard Hayes take the ledger?" the man with the pliers demanded in heavily accented English, striking Jean-Luc across the jaw. Before the smuggler could spit out a reply, Silas stepped out of the shadows. "He isn't going to tell you," Silas said, his voice echoing coldly through the warehouse. The 2 cleaners spun around, raising their weapons, but Silas and Harrison were faster. 2 muffled thwips cut through the air. The man with the rifle dropped instantly. a neat hole between his eyes. The second man managed to fire a wild burst that shattered the wooden crates above Nora's head before Silas put 2 rounds into his chest. The silence that followed was deafening, save for the pinging of spent shell casings on the concrete floor. Nora gasped for air, her hands trembling as she wiped wood splinters from her coat. Silas immediately turned to her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice tight with an emotion that bordered on panic. "No," Nora breathed, staring at the bodies. "I'm okay." Silas let out a harsh breath, his thumbs briefly brushing her cheeks before he turned his attention to the bleeding smuggler. He walked over to Jean-Luc and pulled a combat knife from his boot, slicing the thick zip ties binding the man's wrists. Jean-Luc slumped forward, coughing violently. "Rousseau," he wheezed, looking up through a swollen eye. "I didn't tell them. I swear on my mother's grave." "I know you didn't, Jean-Luc," Silas said, his tone commanding, but devoid of his usual cruelty. "Where is Richard?" "An old hunting cabin," the smuggler gasped, clutching his bruised ribs. "Laurentian Mountains, near Mont Tremblant. He came to me 2 days ago, terrified. Said he stole a book from your uncle's warehouse before he torched it. A black ledger." Silas froze, the muscles in his back coiled tightly beneath his overcoat. "A black ledger." "Yes," Jean-Luc nodded weakly. He said it had names. Bank accounts in Zurich. Payouts. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it was his only leverage to stay alive. "These men, they showed up an hour ago. They are a strike team." "They already sent a second unit up the mountain." Silas turned to Harrison, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, absolute fury. "Get the cars. Now!" As they rushed out of the warehouse, Nora grabbed Silas's arm. "What is the black ledger, Silas? Why are you looking like that?" Silas looked down at her, the storm in his eyes raging. "My Uncle Vincent was old school. He didn't trust digital servers. He kept the syndicate's deepest secrets, our highest-level bribes, our offshore accounts, our moles in the federal government, in a handwritten physical ledger. If the architect hired your father to burn the warehouse, it wasn't just to kill my uncle. It was to destroy the ledger," Nora realized, the horror dawning on her. "Exactly," Silas said, pulling her toward the waiting SUV. "But your father, in his desperate greed, stole it before lighting the match. He accidentally saved the very thing the architect wanted buried. And whoever the architect is, they are terrified of what is written on those pages." The drive into the Laurentian Mountains was a treacherous, high-speed ascent through blinding whiteout conditions. The Escalade's snow tires fought for grip on the winding, unplowed roads. Nora sat tensely in the back, her heart in her throat. Every minute that ticked by was a minute the assassins had to reach her father and brother. Silas sat beside her, loading fresh magazines for his sidearm and a compact Heckler and Coke MP5. The air in the car was thick with adrenaline and impending violence. "When we arrive, you do not leave the vehicle," Silas ordered, slapping a magazine into the submachine gun with a sharp click. "Harrison will stay with you. The doors lock from the inside. The glass is bulletproof against anything short of a .50 caliber." "No," Nora said, her voice shaking but resolute. "They are my family, Silas. If they see armed men rushing the cabin, Tommy will panic and do something stupid. They need to see my face." "It is a combat zone, Nora," Silas snapped, his protective instincts warring with his cold logic. "These men are elite mercenaries. I cannot protect you if you are running into the crossfire." "You don't have to protect me," she fired back, her eyes locked with his. "You just have to let me do my part. My father has the ledger. If you want it, you need me to talk him down. He thinks you want him dead for the fire. He won't hand it over to the Rousseau syndicate." Silas stared at her. The fierce, unyielding light in her eyes was intoxicating. She was a waitress from a broken diner, yet she possessed a strength that rivaled the most hardened men in his organization. He reached out, his gloved hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her forehead against his. "If you die today," Silas whispered, his breath warm against her chilled skin, "I will burn this entire country to the bedrock. Do you understand me?" "Then keep me alive," she whispered back. The SUV skidded to a halt at the base of a steep, snow-covered driveway. Through the dense pine trees, the silhouette of a rustic log cabin was barely visible against the whiteout. "3 vehicles parked halfway up," Harrison reported from the front seat, peering through thermal binoculars. "Engines are still warm. The strike team is already here." "Move," Silas commanded. They spilled out of the SUV into the knee-deep snow. Silas kept Nora directly behind him, his tall frame shielding her as they pushed through the freezing wind. The sound of muffled shouting carried down the mountain, followed instantly by the sharp, terrifying crack of gunfire. "Tommy!" Nora screamed, abandoning caution and surging forward. Silas grabbed the collar of her coat, pulling her down behind a massive snowdrift, just as a spray of bullets shredded the pine branches above their heads. "Suppressing fire!" Silas roared to Harrison and his men. The Russo enforcers opened up, laying down a relentless barrage of gunfire towards the front porch of the cabin. Under the cover of the deafening noise, Silas dragged Nora up the snowy embankment, flanking the cabin from the east. Through the shattered front window, Nora could see the chaotic scene inside. 2 mercenaries were pinned down behind a heavy oak dining table. At the top of a narrow wooden staircase, Tommy was wildly firing a hunting rifle, screaming in terror. Behind him, huddled in the shadows of the landing, was her father, Richard, clutching a thick, leather-bound book to his chest. "They have the high ground, but they are outgunned," Silas assessed coldly, leaning against the exterior log wall. He pulled a flashbang grenade from his tactical vest. "Cover your ears and close your eyes." He pulled the pin and tossed it through the broken window. Bang! The blinding flash and concussive shockwave rocked the cabin. Silas moved with terrifying speed, vaulting through the window frame before the smoke even began to clear. He executed the 2 disoriented mercenaries with chilling precision. 2 shots to the chest, 1 to the head for each. The cabin fell deathly silent, save for the ringing in Nora's ears and Tommy's panicked hyperventilating on the stairs. Nora scrambled through the window after Silas, ignoring the sharp glass that tore at her jeans. "Dad! Tommy! It's me!" At the top of the stairs, Richard Hayes froze. He was pale, gaunt, and looked like he had aged 20 years in a week. He stared down at Nora as if looking at a ghost. "Nora? Oh my God! Nora, how?" "Drop the rifle, Tommy," Silas commanded, his weapon still raised and leveled directly at her brother's chest. "Do it now, or I will paint the walls with you." Tommy sobbed, dropping the hunting rifle so it clattered down the wooden stairs. Nora ran to the bottom of the steps. "Dad, it's okay. Silas isn't going to kill you, but you have to give him the book." Richard gripped the black ledger tighter, his eyes darting wildly between his daughter and the Mafia boss. "He's a Russo, Nora. You don't understand. I read it. I read the book. I know who hired us to burn the warehouse." Silas stepped forward, lowering his weapon just an inch, his eyes locked on Richard. "Who is the architect, Richard? Give me the name, and your debt is erased. Your family walks free. You have my word as the head of the family." Richard swallowed hard, his hands trembling violently. He slowly descended the stairs, clutching the book like a shield. He didn't hand it to Silas. He handed it to Nora. It wasn't a rival family, Richard choked out, tears streaming down his weathered face. "The payments for the arson, the hit on your uncle." The money came from an account registered to a shell company, but the authorizing signature, the secondary name on the account. Nora opened the heavy leather cover. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten codes and financial records, but tucked into the back cover was a printed bank manifest that Richard had clearly cross-referenced. Nora read the name at the bottom of the page, her blood running cold. She looked up at Silas, her heart breaking for the monster who had saved her. "Silas," Nora whispered, her voice cracking. "The signature. It's Lorenzo Russo." Silas stood perfectly still, the color draining from his face. The air in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lorenzo Russo, his younger brother, his own flesh and blood. The architect wasn't an external enemy. It was a coup from inside his own house. His brother had orchestrated the murder of their uncle and framed a degenerate gambler, all to seize control of the syndicate. Before Silas could speak, before the shattering betrayal could fully register in his eyes, the heavy wooden front door of the cabin was kicked completely off its hinges. Standing in the doorway, framed by the blinding snowstorm, was Lorenzo Russo himself, flanked by 6 heavily armed men. Lorenzo smiled, a cold reptilian curving of his lips that looked terrifyingly identical to Silas's own. "Hello, brother," Lorenzo said smoothly, raising a custom silver-plated pistol. "I see you found our little loose ends." The biting wind howled through the shattered front door of the cabin, whipping snow across the blood-stained floorboards. Lorenzo Russo stood there, a vision of tailored cashmere and lethal intent, looking at his older brother with a mixture of pity and triumph. Behind him, 6 men equipped with heavy tactical gear fanned out, their assault rifles raised and locked onto Silas, Harrison, and the trembling Hayes family on the stairs. Nora stopped breathing. She clutched the black ledger against her chest, her knuckles white. "Uncle Vincent was a dinosaur, Silas," Lorenzo drawled, stepping over the corpse of one of his own mercenaries without a second glance. He was hoarding the family's wealth in those archaic, physical ledgers, refusing to digitize, refusing to modernize. Over $400 million locked away in the vaults of Pictet and Tai in Geneva, and the old man wouldn't let me touch a dime for the offshore expansion. Silas didn't raise his weapon. He stood perfectly still, a terrifying monument of contained violence. "So you hired a desperate addict to burn him alive. You used a degenerate gambler to strike the match, assuming I would spend the next year hunting ghosts in the slums while you quietly assumed control of the accounts." "It was the perfect narrative," Lorenzo smiled, his eyes flashing with manic pride. "A tragic accident. The mighty Russo family brought low by the sheer, unpredictable chaos of street junkies. No one would ever suspect a coup. And it would have worked beautifully if Richard hadn't been so greedy. If he hadn't snatched the book off the desk before tossing the Molotov." Lorenzo turned his cold, reptilian gaze toward Nora and her father. "I have spent $2 million tracking this pathetic excuse for a family. And now I get to tie up all my loose ends in one neat, frozen little bow." "You are forgetting one detail, little brother," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating register that cut through the sound of the howling blizzard. Lorenzo scoffed, raising his silver-plated pistol and aiming it directly at Silas's chest. "And what is that?" "I am the boss of this family," Silas whispered, "and I never walk into a blind spot." Before Lorenzo could register the words, the deafening roar of a heavy diesel engine shattered the night. The wall behind Lorenzo exploded inward in a shower of splintered logs and drywall as a reinforced snowplow truck rammed directly into the side of the cabin. The structural collapse was instantaneous. 3 of Lorenzo's men were crushed instantly beneath the falling timber. The floor buckled, sending Lorenzo stumbling backward into the snow. Silas didn't hesitate. In the blinding chaos of dust, snow, and screaming timber, he moved like a predator, unleashed. He raised his MP5 and fired a controlled, sweeping burst into the remaining mercenaries. Harrison was right beside him, his weapon barking in a deadly rhythm, dropping the threats before they could even reorient their aim. "Get down!" Nora screamed to her father and brother, tackling them to the wooden floor of the landing as stray bullets chewed through the drywall above their heads. The firefight lasted less than 10 seconds, but the devastation was absolute. When the echoing crack of gunfire finally faded, the only sound left was the violent rushing of the wind through the destroyed cabin. Silas dropped his empty submachine gun and drew his heavy Sig Sauer. He stepped out through the ruined wall and into the raging blizzard. Nora crawled to the edge of the jagged floorboards, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she peered out into the darkness. Lorenzo was on his knees in the deep snow, coughing up blood. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, shattered by a bullet. He looked up, his arrogant facade finally crumbling into raw, animalistic terror as Silas towered over him. The storm swallowed them, rendering them as two dark silhouettes against the blinding white. "Silas." "Brother, wait," Lorenzo choked out, holding up his right hand. "We are blood. You cannot kill your own blood. The Commission won't allow it. We can share the Pictet accounts. We can—" "You forfeited your blood the night you burned Uncle Vincent," Silas interrupted, his tone devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. Silas raised the pistol, aiming it precisely between his brother's eyes. There was no hesitation, no cinematic pause. Just the brutal, efficient execution of the underworld's highest law. Crack. Lorenzo slumped backward into the snow, lifeless. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and final. Silas stood over the body for a long moment, the silver scar on his jaw illuminated by the pale moonlight breaking through the clouds. He lowered his weapon and turned slowly, walking back into the ruined cabin. He looked up at the landing. Richard and Tommy were huddled together, weeping silently in the shadows. But Nora was standing. She was covered in dust, her hands scraped and bloody, still clutching the black ledger. She met Silas's stormy eyes, and in that gaze, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The waitress who had trembled in Sullivan's diner was gone. She had watched empires crumble and blood spill, and she had survived. "Harrison," Silas commanded, never breaking eye contact with Nora. "Take Richard and Tommy to the airfield. Give them new passports, new names, and enough cash to disappear into South America. If they ever return to the United States, I will bury them myself," Richard sobbed, nodding frantically. He looked at his daughter, a final, agonizing plea for forgiveness in his eyes. "Nora, come with us, please." Nora looked at her father. She felt a profound sadness, a heavy grief for the childhood she never had, and the family she was finally letting go of. He had loved her in his own twisted, broken way, but his love was a poison she could no longer drink. "No, Dad," Nora said softly, her voice steady and clear. "My life in the ashes is over." She walked down the shattered staircase, stepping over the debris, and stopped in front of Silas. She held out the black ledger. Silas looked at the book, and then at her. He didn't take it. Instead, he reached out, his warm, rough hands gently framing her face. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. He smelled of gunpowder, winter air, and absolute power. "You hold the keys to the kingdom, Nora," Silas murmured, his thumb brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. "Are you sure you want to stay in the dark?" Nora dropped the ledger onto the nearest intact table. She reached up, her hands tangling in the collar of his coat, pulling him closer. "I don't want the dark, Silas," she whispered, her lips brushing against his. "I want the crown." The underworld never truly sleeps, but it does bow to new royalty. In the months that followed the massacre in the Laurentian Mountains, the Russo Syndicate underwent a ruthless, bloody restructuring. Silas purged the remaining loyalists of his traitorous brother, securing his absolute dominance over the city's shadows and the billions hidden in Geneva. But the greatest shock to the families of the Commission wasn't Silas's undisputed reign. It was the woman standing at his side. Nora Hayes, the ghost of a burned-down diner, traded her stained apron for bespoke silk and lethal authority. She was no longer leverage. She was the architect of her own destiny, matching Silas's ruthless intellect move for move. Together, they ruled an empire built on the ashes of betrayal, proving that the most dangerous weapon in a Mafia war isn't the gun. It's the woman who refuses to break.